I'm Susan Hassel. I've been working in climate change communication for more than 30 years. And I've worked with scientists to help them communicate more effectively. I was the writer on the first 3 national climate assessments. I've written an HBO documentary called Too Hot Not to Handle. Testified before Congress, and increasingly these days I'm helping journalists to report more and better on the subject of climate change as a local issue and a personal issue. A colleague of mine, the late Stephen Schneider, some of you who are veterans in the field might remember him, he used to say, we should communicate about climate change so anyone could understand us, from 3rd graders all the way down to members of Congress.
That's true.
Never been more true. So, oh, the camera's running. So we have a really great panel today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We have a doctor, we have a pollster, we have a journalist. They have 3 very different perspectives on this. But I think altogether we're going to hear a very interesting and well-rounded story about the new challenges that we're facing in climate change communication. So I think we will start with Laurie. And I'll ask each of you to first introduce yourself, and then 5 to 7 minutes of remarks, and then we're going to have a little moderated conversation up here, and then we'll open it to questions from you all.
Great, thank you. So I'm Laurie Wagle. I'm a principal with Newbridge Strategy, which is my own firm that I started after being in public opinion research for various Republican polling firms over the last 2.5 decades. And so in that work, I've seen a lot of evolution in terms of what both elected officials on the more conservative side of the spectrum, as well as voters are telling us and reacting to in terms of the recent news cycles. And the good news is we're seeing lots and lots of change very recently. So I spend a lot of my time talking to more conservative voters, but I've sort of developed a unique niche in terms of being a conservative conservationist. So in that respect, I actually left my old firm in part because climate change was seen as too controversial to fit in with many of the members of Congress and the political campaigns that that firm was doing. So what are we seeing lately? I think that what we're seeing is significant change just in the last couple of years, really. You know, when I started doing this work, I remember one of the very first focus groups that I moderated, so it's not all just polling, it's also sitting and, I used to say talking to people, but really it's listening to people. And when we listen to people, I remember I was in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, in early 2000s, and we were looking at McCain-Lieberman legislation, so that's how long ago that was. And I remember one woman in a group of white evangelical voters said, why are we talking about this? None of this is going to matter because the rapture is coming and we won't have to worry about any of this. And so for those of you not familiar with white evangelicals, so it basically meant Jesus Christ was coming back to earth and we weren't going to have to worry about any of this stuff. So now we've evolved to where I was just in Kansas City and I had a group of conservative voters on Monday evening, and they all said, coal's dirty, it's outdated, it's bad, there's wind turbines popping up everywhere, why aren't we moving more towards this? And climate came up without any rolling of eyes and shrugging of shoulders. We used to actually not talk about climate change in live focus groups. We shifted all of that to online because Republican voters would shut down. They didn't want to talk about it. They would sit there and literally sort of shrink into themselves, their body language changed. It was because, and they'd say things like, wow, well, that's a hot button. And they'd kind of look around to see whatever, you know, because it's a little awkward. You're in a room full of strangers and there's very few of you, and you're being asked to talk about something that they're pretty sure someone's going to have very strong views on. Things are changing because we have to be careful about this. They're not changing dramatically, and they're mostly changing on the sort of left end of the spectrum, where Democrat primary voters now place climate change on par with health care as an issue that they're telling us they're going to vote on. With the Republican end, it's far less salient, meaning they are far less likely to say that that's going to determine their vote. but they are more willing and they have lots of questions about it in terms of they're more willing to enter that conversation. In part, we're seeing that's because of what they would call weird weather. And it's not a crisis, and they very much push back when we say crisis. And lots of times when they see something that is all about quote unquote climate change effects, that leads them to say, oh, that's just all doom and gloom. That's those liberals saying the sky is falling, all of that. Instead, what they're seeing is weird, and it's very localized, and sometimes it's very personal. For example, I had a Republican man in New Hampshire who told me that lacrosse season, they're having to adjust the dates of lacrosse season. Like the practice fields aren't covered in snow exactly when they used to be. I had an older Republican woman who also told me that I should be talking to her daughter who cared about this topic at the end of the group. She was like, honey, you really should have had my daughter here. She knows so much more about this. But she told me her roses were growing. They're blooming at different times. It's a very personal and local. And then just very recently, this topic wasn't even climate change. It was fisheries on the Great Lakes. And we were talking to commercial fishermen and charter boat captains about what they're seeing in terms of fisheries. And one of my questions was, what's different than 10 years ago? And he said, and you'll excuse my French, I'll be quoting a charter boat captain on Lake Erie. He said, well, 10 years ago, I would have told you this climate change stuff was a bunch of bullshit. But today, yeah, I can't say that anymore. Things are weird. Like the fisher I'm having to relearn how to fish. And you know, some of that is obviously algae and some of the difficulties they're having in terms of water quality there. But, you know, I mean, he just said the storms were different, the weather patterns were different, all of it was different. And so it can be really personal and it can be really local in terms of what they're seeing that's leading them to have questions. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges in our recent work earlier this year. We did those in terms of online bulletin board conversations with mostly Republican women. Republican women tend to be a little more open to new information than Republican men. Well, honestly, that's true across party lines, really. But they still had very, very basic questions. So when we said, if a neutral expert walked in, what would you want to know about? And it's like, how much is man playing a role in this? Is this really happening? You know, just really fundamental questions. What's going to happen in the future? What can we do about it? And that's the other thing that we often see is that people really want to hear more about solutions because they feel like a litany of bad stuff happening it just really overwhelms them. Anything, any sort of kernel nuggets of hope, I usually talk about the truffula tree seed. They really want to see, you know, what are those nuggets, those little kernels of hope that they can find out there in terms of solutions. So it's really offering up some solutions, not just effects, is something that we see people yearning for today. I've got lots more, but I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Okay.
Good morning.
Chris.
I'm Chris Russell. I've been a science journalist writ large, from public health to environment, and a lot of politics in between for more than 4 decades. I'm not going to say how much more, but I did cover the late Steve Schneider, who also did a lot in terms of language, distinguishing weather from climate and other ways to think about it. I find that my background, it was in newspapers to start with. For 20 years, I was at the Washington Post. And so virtually every story had the word and politics in it if it was going to get a lot of attention. So I got drawn into a lot of the controversies, and certainly this is one of the areas of controversy over several decades. I've also been interested throughout my career in improving coverage of science, both by journalists as well as experts. And I was the president of the National Association of Science Writers and still working with the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. And I'm at the Kennedy School now. I'm a senior fellow at the Environment and Natural Resources program. And I also teach a class called Controversies in Climate, Energy, and the Media. And it's really directed at the idea that most of the students are public policy students, and they have the opportunity, as we all know in this room, to communicate directly with audiences, and they need to become better communicators. And certainly scientists and experts have always been on the least good end of communication with many of the activists and business groups and lobbyists and such, much more effective at getting out messages. So I want to talk a little bit about what's wrong, what's right, how climate change coverage can be improved. I recently published an article which is in the resources list called A Scary Year for the Climate. I had felt a bit overwhelmed myself trying to keep track of all of the massive reports that came out over the last year, and I'm sure many in this room covered various ones, starting with the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's easier to say IPCC, and I'm still assuming there could be someone in this room who does not know what IPCC is, but that report in October of 2018, which got translated by the media into a 12-year deadline, as we know, to do something about climate change. The report itself mentioned 2030. They didn't quite put it that way, but starting with that report, there have been blockbuster reports on biodiversity, oceans, so many that when I sat down to kind of put these in order and make a virtual bookshelf, I did find myself overwhelmed when I had to look at all 12 of the ones I selected again. And so I think that's one of the hazards of the beat, is looking at too much information and being affected as you are over time in terms of the enormity of the problem. So on the good news side, I do think finally there is a lot more news and feature media coverage of this subject. I'm sure many of your institutions and outlets participated in the Covering Climate Now that was organized by Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation, over 350 outlets writing about it in many forms around the world. And so I think that's encouraging, and we definitely have the polling showing greater recognition and concern about the problem by the vast majority of people. And I guess one of the problems in the coverage is we tend to yo-yo between the dueling experts or dueling causes on both sides, and really keeping the audience in mind is sometimes complicated, and certainly not getting in a bubble yourself with all of this knowledge and of science and local impacts and such, to really realize that the audience is pretty broad on this subject, and the goal is to try to reach, obviously, as many people as possible. Certainly, the coverage has been dominated by the gloom and doom narrative, but I think there is, again, some more balance in terms of more solutions-oriented journalism. How many of you get the Daily Climate or look at that? Mm-hmm. So it's an aggregator which does go a great way toward, has categories which include good news at the end, but I noticed that this morning. But they have solutions, causes, politics, policies, and it's a really good way to kind of wake up and see things in the morning across a broad spectrum. I think so. Looking for examples for solutions, I think that's a harder job, but I think we're seeing more of that coverage. I know we're going to talk about solutions journalism throughout the conference, humanizing the story, particularly not just showing groups of people or communities as victims, but as showing and looking for examples. And I hate the buzzwords, but they do mean something: resilience and adaptation. was recently in Reykjavik, Iceland, at a conference on Arctic Circle Assembly, and we had a panel on humanizing and particularly bringing indigenous populations actively into the story and not as victims whose villages are sliding off into the sea. And those stories, again, take resources, harder to get out of the many, even if your office is your kitchen, it's harder to get away from the computer to actually get some human stories. Localizing the story, and sometimes that can be done at your desk. There's so many databases now where you can type in a zip code and get information about health impacts or other problems that relate to your local community. Again, all climate change is not equal in terms of its impact, and so writing more about vulnerable communities, whether geographically, I think there's a lot of lip service now to environmental justice or climate justice reporting, but I think it is an important area to be doing more coverage of how certain communities and groups of people economically, racially, and otherwise are impacted by climate change. We're going to hear more about climate change as a public health emergency. I think if we look at children, we all know that stories about children get a lot of eyeballs. Certainly the youth movement with Greta Thunberg and many other young activists has created a new dynamic in terms of energy about doing something in climate. I think recognizing the scientific consensus is still important, not assuming that everybody agrees with it. Long ago, when I was covering the HIV/AIDS crisis, I felt it was really important at the Washington Post to include in almost every story a nut graph about the way in which the HIV virus was or was not transmitted, something along the lines of the virus is not transmitted through casual contact, but instead through intimate sexual contact or intravenous blood transfusions. And putting that in, that was not an advocacy thing. It was really, I think, responsible journalism to repeat that. And particularly at that time, there was a lot of fear of transmission. And I think the news media did a respectable job in terms of talking, particularly science reporters and health reporters, about how it was transmitted. And I think the same thing can be done in climate change stories, where you do try to have a graph ready that if you have enough words available to put in that line about, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is caused by human activities. And then you can go on and explain, fossil fuel, depending on how much you want in your nut graph. This poses greater, potentially irreversible damage in the future if actions are not taken to cut back greenhouse gas emissions. So I feel pretty strongly that if you just keep that in mind, it can be a message that's very true, and it's not really something for dueling scientists. And so we'll talk a little bit about false balance. There are certainly reasons to get controversy into a story in terms of what you do about it, but I don't think there is a debate, legitimate debate, about the fact that human-caused climate change is happening. Perception is reality. Again, I used to, when I started out, think that fact-based journalism information would really do the trick. You just present this information and people will get it and they'll accept it. And I think we all know that the behavioral research has shown, again, how much emotions impact how people read or listen or view information. And so keeping that in mind and trying to portray things in a way that reach people emotionally as well as a bunch of facts, which really never works. two other things, avoiding the kind of seesaw. On the solution side, we often see energy stories, and particularly when they are pitched as a new solution to capturing carbon or doing this or that, it will be seen as a breakthrough. So far, there are no breakthroughs that anybody in this room is going to cover in real time. It may be a breakthrough when we look back at it, but really, I think avoiding this kind of techno-optimism, which inevitably turns into techno-pessimism. And so we just kind of go up and down. And I think that is really a disservice to the audience, who start to, just as they dismiss what public health thinks about red meat or wine, they kind of see, well, like, I don't know, I thought that was supposed to be so great, and it didn't work, and that didn't work. So finally, I think accountability journalism is really important. There's been a tendency to celebrate all of the pledges to go to zero carbon emissions by 2050, whether it's countries or cities, also businesses saying they're going to do this and that. Following up and finding out, well, really, how are you going to do that? How realistic it is. I see, particularly on Twitter, a gazillion of these pledges, and I see much less coverage about, how they're going to do it, how they say they're going to do it, and then looking 5 years on to see what it means. And we certainly know with the Paris Agreement that now people are looking at those pledges made and realizing they're completely insufficient to accomplish the goal of controlling the impacts of climate change. I guess finally, climate change is part of every story. I did see this morning on Twitter a young Latina 14-year-old activist, Alexandria Villaseñor. She had a little Twitter thing that said, climate is a biodiversity issue, agriculture issue, race, immigration, healthcare, disability, human rights, economic. And she summed it up by saying, climate is everything. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you have to write about everything in every story, but there is an angle, and many of the angles are ways that are not the conventional wisdom. So I think looking for a sports story with climate change because events are being canceled, or old wooden baseball bats can't be made anymore because that tree is no longer growing, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Okay, Ari?
Good morning. I'm totally thrilled to be here with you this morning. I'm Laurie Bernstein. I'm a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital, which is across the river. I'm the co-director of Sea Change, so I heard you got to hear from Gina last night. The rafters still seem to be intact, but occasionally she's been known to pull down the rafters when she talks. And I'm also helping run a climate initiative at the Harvard Global Health Institute, which is here in Harvard Square. And I want to start by asking you all a question, which is, and we'll play this two ways. Has anyone here had an infection, a bacterial infection that's resistant to antibiotics, or known someone who's had an infection resistant to antibiotics? Yeah. So what causes antibiotic resistance? Why do we have, so I've taken care of children as young as 4 months old, children that young often get urinary tract infections, which when I started practicing were no big deal. You gave them a standard issue antibiotic and they got better, and you wanted to make sure you didn't miss it, but once you found it, it was no big deal. I've now taken care of children with such infections for which no antibiotic works. We don't have a single antibiotic that will treat these children. So why do we have an epidemic and a major public health problem from antibiotic resistance? People like me doling out too many antibiotics, right? It's a big problem. Also, people giving antibiotics to cows and livestock. So there's far more antibiotics given to livestock than people. And then, of course, a lot of these resistance genes are coming from overseas. So a lot of the resistance genes are cultivated in other countries and they get imported. What else causes antibiotic resistance? So that actually is one of the great myths. That's what I was taught in medical school, but it turns out that is in fact not true.
Wow.
We can talk about that later.
That's good to know.
It is.
So you've all been primed for this. What if climate change was a major determinant of antibiotic resistance? So a colleague of mine, John Bernstein at Children's, published a study last year looking at tens of millions of isolates of organisms that cause urinary tract infections in the children that I treat, and showed that, in fact, there is an enormously strong correlation between ambient temperature in the United States and rates of resistance in these organisms. That study was followed up by another study in Europe that looked at sewage treatment plants and looked at the bacteria coming into the plant and the resistant rates of those organisms. And the biggest determinant of the resistance patterns were, what you all said, how much antibiotics are prescribed to the population. But then you let them sit in the sewage treatment plant for a while, and what comes out? What's the major determinant of resistance? Temperature. Mm-hmm. So what if a major factor in our rates of resistance is temperature? Why do I tell you the story, and why did I ask you the question? It's because health is a transcendent issue in climate change, and don't take my opinion for it. There's lots of research behind this. So climate change has become a politicized issue. Well, that's a disaster in the making because it's not a political issue at all. And how do we depoliticize it, and how do we make it human? Well, let me tell you, if I see a parent who has a child with a resistant infection, I tell that parent, I used to be able to treat this just fine with a very cheap single antibiotic, and now I don't have a single antibiotic for you. That parent would take out their left lung, kidney, brain, and whatever to figure out a way to make that less resistant. They want to know why. And then you tell them, one of the things that we think may be driving our problem is warming. Same thing. So you'll hear later today from Mary Rice. Mary Rice is a pulmonologist. She had a whole article. It went viral. It was done by Martha. Is Martha here? I think she'll be here today. Actually, I think she may be moderating the panel. Martha Bebinger is a BUR reporter. And she wrote a profile of Mary, and the question was, do you talk about climate change with your patients? And Mary is very eloquent about this, and she described how with patients, she's a pulmonologist, she treats patients with chronic lung diseases whose disease is heavily influenced by allergen exposure. Well, the allergy season is much longer now than it was, right? So springs are earlier, falls are later. Ragweed, anyone allergic to ragweed? Right? A lot of people are allergic to ragweed, one of the most common allergens. Ragweed plants today are probably producing twice as much pollen as they were at the Industrial Revolution because of the change in the carbon dioxide concentration in the air. Let me make that clear again. Mm-hmm. Industrial Revolution, there was about half as much, well, less than half as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as today. The change between then and today, based upon experimental evidence in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, makes ragweed plants put out about twice as much pollen. So we're seeing longer seasons with more pollen, and that means that the patients who've had these diseases for a long time are saying, my disease is having worsenings early in the year. What's going on? Well, there's more pollen. It's starting earlier. Well, why is that? So it's transcendent because, one, it makes it immediately personal. Two, it's not about politics. People who have diseases understand, hopefully people understand that bacteria can cause disease and that allergies can be caused by pollen. And then the question becomes, well, why is this changing? Why do we have resistance? Now, I'm not going to go out there and say that the main problem with antibiotic resistance is anything other than overprescription of antibiotics, and that is the main issue. But I think it's a very compelling story when you start talking about, is climate going to make this challenge we're already facing head on more difficult? That's a very interesting story. So, in case you were wondering, I'm here to tell you that health is an important thing to talk about. So what's the research tell us? Well, so there's all kinds of rationales to write about climate change. You can talk about national security, you can talk about economics, you can talk about cultural values, you can talk about religious values, and all of these to the audiences you're talking to may be a very salient and powerful argument. We had a whole, it was a long time ago now, there's a group of us that went to Shishmaref, Alaska from our center. There were evangelical Christians and scientists, and the whole deal was everyone cared about, in one lingo, creation care, and another lingo about, saving human lives. And the whole concept was to bridge scientific and religious thought. And it was a very powerful exercise on how you can bring people of divergent interests focused on human welfare. But if you look at all these messages across the U.S. population, health messages tend to be one of the most effective at changing where these issues lie. So you heard about, in more democratic circles, climate change is almost at the top of what people are voting on. In conservative circles, it tends to be less. But in both, health messages have, across the board, the biggest influence on how people perceive the issue, right? On a population average issue. So the last thing I will say is that it's not just about health, and I would argue the solutions, which we can talk about more. If I had a prescription to write for the problems in health that have been impossible to deal with, the obesity epidemic, Alzheimer's, mental health in adolescents, so there's a higher rate of suicide in adolescents in the United States than ever, you name it, diabetes. People write endlessly about paying for this, right? How are we going to finance healthcare? What's the insurance plan going to be? It doesn't matter, folks. Doesn't matter. If we have 30% of the people in the country overweight or obese, 6 to 10% of people with diabetes, I don't care who's paying for it. It is a disaster. Number one reason for military disqualification in the United States is obesity. The only way you fix these problems is by preventing them. And here's the amazing part. The solutions to these problems, the preventive solutions, are exactly what we need to do for climate change. They're the same solutions, and no one's talking about this. You want to fix obesity? We got to get people out of cars. We got to eat healthier foods. We got to eat less red meat. Despite the debate, the evidence is very clear that eating red meat is not good for people. We can talk about that more too. We need to get people on, we need to get better access to public transit, right? Mm-hmm. So there's very good evidence about people's mode of transportation and body mass index or obesity, et cetera, et cetera. And the very last thing I'll say, when it comes to health and solutions, I don't care who I've met across this world as a pediatrician taking care of a child, everybody cares about their children. And so focusing on the solutions, particularly when it comes in the context of making the lives of our children better, is one of the most powerful arguments out there, particularly when we have news, which is, in my line of work, enormously difficult to swallow, which is that the current generation of American children may live shorter lives than everyone in this room because of our inability to prevent disease, particularly nutritional and dietary problems like obesity. And so finding solutions addressed to that are just critically important. And if climate can elevate those issues, that we get a win for obesity, which may shorten our children's lives, and we're going to give them a healthier future, and by the way, a healthier present, that's pretty powerful news. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great. Let's take a minute and thank all of our speakers. Okay, so we heard from all of you about some ways of personalizing and localizing this story. What do you think are give us each of you an example or two of an untold story in the arena that you work in, untold or undertold, that you feel like the journalists in this room might be interested in picking up? Let me start with you, Laurie.
So, that's a hard one. Well, I think there's a few things. I do think that a lot of the coverage does tend to focus on effects, and that's reasonable, and that is having an impact on people. The weirding of the weather, fires in California, all of this really does affect people. But what gets them intrigued and interested and keeps them tuned in, I really feel like, is the solutions aspect. And, I just sat and talked to people about clean energy earlier this week, and they really don't, look, people are leading busy lives. They're getting their kids to soccer, they're working, they're doing all this stuff, so that this is not what they wake up every day thinking about. But it pops up in little ways, and when they do pop up, and forgive me, but they are seeing their news in very, very bite-sized chunks now. It is the stuff that gets them excited, is things like battery storage, to be honest. And I know we have to avoid the up and down, but something that gives them some ray of hope amidst the California's burning down and floods are coming and all this, it sounds like pestilence and locusts, is, they have very little sense of what innovations are taking place. They're worried about, will wind turbines actually fall down? Some basic things. And people get excited when they start talking about, I read something about how solar film is going to be on shingles of roofs, and everybody, when you replace your roof, it's automatically going to become basically a little power station. And And honestly, you wouldn't think battery storage would be all that exciting, but they get fired up about it. It's like talking about, one of the analogies that we've seen that's powerful is talking about, it's like food storage prior to having refrigerators, right? You used to have to like use up your food, grow your food right there, use it up. Versus, now today we can obviously store food, and there's been some downsides of that in terms of preservatives and horrible things that affect our diet. But, this idea that we're on the cusp of new innovations is exciting. Mm-hmm. That said, they will still tell us that we know what to do. We know exactly what to do to help address some of these climate change problems. We're just not doing it. And they very much feel that it is political will and that it is the big bad lobbyists and major corporations that are stalling that. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of the work that I do is really to try and affect change in terms of public policy. It's less about how do you report some of these changes. And so we're always trying to get people to move in terms of that. I will say, too, they are skeptical. They are skeptical of everything they read today. They tell us that they turn on the TV, you turn it on one channel, you hear one thing. You turn on the other channel, you hear the exact opposite. And so they're incredibly skeptical, even when it comes to like pieces of paper that I would put in front of them. They're like, how do you know that? Where's that fact come from? And so when we say 97% of scientists say, first of all, it matters if you say climate scientists versus scientists. Mm-hmm. If you put climate in front of it, our conservatives will immediately be more skeptical versus just saying scientists. And secondly, it matters if you even say, as NASA points out, which honestly means that it's on the NASA website. As NASA points out, 97% of scientists say it is much more believable and credible. Just saying that. And so they tend to want, even though many conservative voters are very skeptical of, quote unquote, the federal government, many of the agencies and institutions that are the federal government are seen with great credibility. So NASA, NOAA, the Department of Defense, obviously, and then we've seen the National Geographic Society. I don't know if it's the stacks of yellow magazines in everybody's grandpa's basement or what it is, but they just say, oh, well, yeah, if they say it, that's amazing. I totally trust that. We had an experiment where we were seeing such skepticism of all the information we were putting in front of people. And so finally I said, okay, let's just send them directly to some websites and let them look at it. I've never seen such massive shifts in people. And granted, it was a small group, it's qualitative, we're having them talk about it. But when they look at they look at the NASA website, they look at the Weather Service, they look at, when they go to those sources, I had people that were flat out deniers at the beginning of the group say, okay, wait, yeah, all right, now I'm rethinking it. And that kind of shift doesn't usually happen over a 3-day period of time by just sending people to a few websites. So the source matters, and being able to reference credible sources really has a massive impact on how willing people, and so a lot of people are already there, granted, but a lot of people still have some pretty fundamental questions, and they need that validation in order to be able to be open to more information. I completely agree with the health aspect too.
Yes.
I'll give you a health story that's not being talked about. So climate change can determine whether you will live or die from cancer. This publication in the Journal of the American Medical Association done by the American Cancer Society showed that people who were affected by Harvey, who were getting treated for lung cancer, those that were in areas that were affected for longer periods of time were more likely to die from cancer. People who were affected by Hurricane Maria. So Hurricane Maria caused a national shortage of IV fluids because all of the bags were manufactured in Puerto Rico. Patients were being, even at Mass General Hospital, all the major teaching hospitals in Boston, there were protocols in place because there was not adequate supply of IV fluids, right? So IV fluids are like the bedrock of medical care. If you don't have IV fluids in a hospital, I don't know what you're doing. And there was a protocol in place to determine whether you were close enough to death to warrant getting the precious IV fluids or getting Gatorade. I'm not making this up. Former students of mine wrote a piece in the New England Journal telling the United States medical community the protocol they were using to decide whether people were getting this stuff, okay? So, people don't know this. People don't have a sense of how personal and direct these extreme events are not. I mean, it's not, and the thing is, people hear, well, it's climate change is someplace far away, it's Puerto Rico. It mattered in Boston, it mattered in every hospital in the United States that I know of. Now, there may be some, I'm confident I haven't talked to a lot, but I can assure you it was a widely geographically distributed problem. Pediatricians. Number one cause of power outages in the United States is extreme weather events. The rates of power outages are going up for a variety of reasons, but the number one cause is extreme weather events, particularly floods, heat waves, right? What do you do when you take your child to a pediatrician? What's the number one reason for a well-child checkup is to get vaccinated. Most vaccines require cold chain. Most pediatric practices do not have backup power supplies. The plan from the CDC to protect those vaccines is for a place to go, to have a backup place. Well, I can guarantee you, being a pediatrician, knowing lots of pediatricians, there is no backup place, right? So, and this is particularly an issue for rural areas, so particularly in red states, this is a big deal. Then critical medical supplies are being lost because they're losing cold chain in the United States, okay? So, the reason that our center is here and the reason we co-sponsored this is because the reality is for most journalists, the health stories you report on are based upon the big reports that are overwhelmingly depressing and the salient articles in very high-profile journals that make it into the news. That's about 5% of what needs to be talked about. So the reason we're here is we want each and every one of you to be calling us and saying what are the health issues that the scientific literature is showing us are relevant that people don't know about. That's why we're here, that's why we're doing this, and that's why I'm thrilled to be here with you. So I can give we have plenty more.
Well, that's really fascinating. Can you say just a little bit more about the mechanism for the cancer increase?
So so this is work of Leticia Nogueira, who's a epidemiologist who works at the American Cancer Society. And she's worked in the Texas Department of Public Health before coming to ACS. And she, in that capacity in the Department of Health, was very concerned about healthcare provision and how Texas, and by the way, Texas has one of the best hurricane coordinated response systems for healthcare in the country because they're so effective. They actually have a very coordinated system of how to triage resources. We can talk about that as a whole nother issue. If a hurricane like Harvey hit anywhere close to Massachusetts, the discombobulation of our response in the healthcare system would make it amplify the effects even more. So she saw this and said, well, what are the people who are at risk from this kind of stuff? Obviously, people are at risk from the United Storm, but what about people with chronic medical conditions? And being at the ACS, she's like, well, what about cancer patients? So in cancer patients, the reason they focused on non-small cell lung cancer is because a mainstay of therapy is radiation therapy. Radiation therapy requires regular intervals of dosing to be effective. And if you miss one, people tend to stop because then your risk to benefit, because radiation therapy is not benign, right? Your risk benefit changes. And so people who had interruptions in their care for longer periods of time were more likely to die because of the lack of effective therapy, right? So it wasn't they got killed in a storm, it wasn't they didn't have medicines, it was their inability to access care and or the ability of those care centers to be functional in the wake of the storm, right?
Fascinating, fascinating. Chris, untold stories?
Well, I'd say everybody in this room could write 5 stories a day if we could churn them out. I think one of the areas that I find most interesting is transportation. I think there's not as much written about how transportation is such a huge contributor in this country to climate change. And I think there's a lot of public interest in alternatives and also generational interest as we're seeing people having fewer cars. I saw a story this morning that was a survey of Americans want action to reduce gas guzzlers sooner rather than later. And so I think transportation, almost any beat has an angle. So transportation is one. I think food and agriculture, not enough is written in that area about connections with changing climate. I think a process thing, in addition to the fact you could look, if you are in a newsroom or work for an outlet, and you looked at all of the resources and the people that you have writing about anything, every one of them could connect their beat or to climate change. And so I think about, almost convincing your outlet to have a day in which everybody's going to write something in this area. I also think I've been so impressed recently with the number of collaborative efforts with national organizations, say ProPublica, or there was Inside Climate News the other day, having a focus on the Midwest and working with St. Louis Post-Dispatch and other smaller outlets in the Midwest. So I think the fact that you can really collaborate across platforms, but across organizations that are non-competitive, I think thinking about how to have more impact with more focus on areas in which one outlet could not really do that by themselves. And there is that cross-fertilization of getting a team working on it. So I think doing some team reporting, whether internal or looking around and saying, hey, I could be working with this other group or person to be covering this beat.
Great.
I was going to say on that respect, that may have been my survey. We just did a survey. It was rural and small town from mid-Atlantic, sort of the northeast seaboard. And I thought, and they were saying we're getting all this resistance with more rural legislators in terms of transportation, options. And I thought, gosh, these guys are nuts. This stuff is just going to bomb. We're talking to really conservative voters. And things like increasing clean public transportation options, such as trains and low-emission buses and van services to smaller towns beyond major cities. We had 82% of rural and small-town voters saying that that was something that they would support their state investing in. Honestly, one of the top things that we tested was clean school buses. So cleaner running school buses, because they said that's going to save us money. Like a lot of the public education dollars are funding rural transportation to get kids to schools. And so, people are telling us this just makes abundant sense. The other thing I see is, especially with conservative voters, they love saving money and they love energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. And so stuff about energy efficiency, I had somebody, they wanted us to make energy efficiency sexy. That was their request. And finally we said, look, we are never going to, we actually had people imagine if energy efficiency, if we had a magic wand and poof, energy efficiency was standing in front of you as a person. I only had one person say it was going to be Fabio. No, there was no one else. No one else. But it was sort of this interesting nerd, and they really wanted to talk to him a lot and find out more about it, and because they saw an immediate self-benefit. Yeah. And so some of the best climate change solutions that we've ever tested relate to just not wasting our energy. Because people just think that's morally, bankrupt, and why would you ever do that? And they tell us stories about going around after their kids and turning off light switches. And, so if we've got cool stuff that can do that, they get pretty excited about that. So I know we're never going to make it sexy, but they still find it interesting, and they see a direct self-benefit.
Yeah, that's great.
I also think there's kind of cross-cutting. Recently, I'm from California, and most of my family was without power in recent weeks. One of my sons has an electric car, so he could not charge his car during that period of time since he was without power. So you see how these things start to connect with
Yeah.
one another. And, the thing, you've got the electric car to do this, and now you can't use it. So connecting the dots between stories where particularly the fires in California have probably created 1 million stories that could be told. And that can be replicated, when we're going through hurricane season and everything else. So.
Well, there's been such a missed opportunity along those lines because for all the stories that have been produced on the fires and the hurricanes, only a very small percentage even mention climate change or the connections. So I want to raise one.
I think it's implicit in a lot of stories. You don't necessarily have to have a story on it. It's a question. I know I saw the data, but I do think people, particularly in California, are connecting the dots on that. And so you may not have a story, but I think there's been enough undercurrent that people recognize that.
I want to raise one more quick question for one more round, and then I want to open it to the group. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the headwind that we face in communicating about all this, which is the disinformation campaign. I think we're seeing something different these days. There's sort of a new face of climate denial. And I'd like to just ask each of you to reflect briefly on that. Laurie, we talked about the sort of delayers kind of thing. Why don't you talk a little bit about that if you like?
Yeah, so, luckily people actually use the work I do. And so we've been on Capitol Hill briefing staffers. So I think one of the things that my clients are really battling is this idea of, okay, so we're going to say that we believe in climate change or we're going to address climate change, but what we really need is more research into these innovations. And people like the word innovate, they like innovations. And so it's a little bit tricky in terms of how you combat that, because at the same time, though, they will tell us, oh, Jimmy Carter had solar panels on the White House. This stuff has been around for a really long time. And so we in a recent survey with conservative voters, we just juxtaposed the two and said, okay, so do we need more innovation into carbon capture and advanced nuclear and all these kinds of things? Or do we know what to do and we just need to put it in place? And it was, it was about 60-40 that said, we know what to do, let's put it into place, which is pretty good when you're still saying, oh, let's put things into innovation. But there's still that seems to be a central theme in some of it now, that everyone's seen the numbers move. We had Gallup has tracked this for a long time, obviously, and now they have 51%, a majority of the public that they dub concerned believers, and that's up from 33% in 2011. So these attitudes aren't changing quite as quickly as, say, marijuana or marriage equality did, but they're changing. And often we really do see that things, all of a sudden they get to this tipping point and they pull over the edge very quickly. And that's what we saw with marijuana, for example. It was very, very fast in terms of how quickly attitudes shifted. And I think we are right in the midst of that same thing happening with climate change. So it's a really exciting time. There's lots of opportunities to be able to incorporate this into, I don't care if it's baseball season, I mean, that's a great story in terms of what's happening and how it affects people's daily lives.
Okay, brief thoughts on that?
Yes, so one of the things you learn as a pediatrician and going through medical training and so forth is a lot of psychology, particularly developmental psychology of children and how they learn all kinds of amazing things in very short amounts of time and how they change, how attitudes and behaviors change. It turns out that fighting established knowledge is extremely hard. If you want to read a really interesting book about this, read a book called When Prophecy Fails by Leon Festinger. He was the psychologist who coined the term cognitive dissonance, and he actually embedded himself with a doomsday cult in Oak Park, Illinois, where my family's from. No relationship to the founders of the doomsday cult. Because he was fascinated, what happens when you have a group of people who've laid their stake in the idea that the world's coming to an end, and it doesn't, right? So what do they think? How do they resolve the dissonance between their beliefs and reality? So what that research started over, 50 or 60 years ago, is that human beings have a very hard time moving from an initial position, right? So climate change has been politicized, and if you look at all the research, it's very clear it's become a partisan issue. And so therefore, people's, as you've heard, and this, I would argue, in some ways, literature shows that conservatives who are skeptical of climate change have better subject matter knowledge than people who are liberals. And conservatives are more honest about their state of understanding than liberals. But I would argue across the board, no one in America is Steve Schneider, who was mentioned 3 times. He was the first person who taught me about climate change when I was an undergraduate, so I owe him an immense amount of that. He was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in the 70s talking about climate change, if you can believe it. Wow. So the expectation cannot be we're going to make everyone in the United States an expert on this. And so how do you deal with the reality that political parties have essentially poisoned the well on both sides, in my view? Now, it's not equal in my mind, but it is not necessarily an absence of misrepresentation of climate science on either side. You have to reach to what I would call more proximal values. You have to get things on the kitchen table, not off the kitchen table. You have to talk about, do you want a healthy child? What is it going to take? Right? It has to start with a conversation that it gets to issues that are closer to what people care about and are less politicized if you're going to make any dent on climate change. Because if you engage on climate change, you're dealing with something that is too far out of their value stream. And I would argue the mental model, the way people understand it, is much too porous. And so if you need to inoculate against misinformation, you've got an enormous uphill battle. Inoculate, I'm a pediatrician, what can I say? How do you inoculate someone against misinformation? If they've been positioned to say the end of the world is coming, and if they move from that, they ostracize themselves from the community that they're close to, that is not a winning proposition, right? Disavow all your religious beliefs, disavow your community for the sake of this one thing that you don't know much about. Ain't gonna happen, folks. You have to find people where they're at. You have to understand what they care about. And the good news with climate change is that you can get there. I mean, transportation, school buses. Best science, 1 in 5 children have asthma, develop asthma because of pollution coming out of school buses. Diesel fuel from school buses, kids are being dosed, kids who are sick are being, so it's the cost issue, it's the health of their children issue, and oh, by the way, we can reduce the carbon footprint, right? You name it, across the board, we can get there. So the mistake that I think often is made is that we try and combat misinformation as a rational exercise. We try and say, well, if only people had it put in the right, most lay terms, simplest way, they would get it. That's not the way, you all know this, I don't have to tell you. That's not the way people work. But I mean, I'm in a community where this is the people believe this, right? People in academia believe that if only we had the knowledge and only we made it clear, and that was the IPCC, by the way. The IPCC was exactly that. We're going to put out the knowledge, and it's going to be completely clear what to do, and we don't have to say anything more. And here's where we are 35 years later.
Can I just say on that point, the least effective thing we tested in terms of getting people, those more conservative voters to want their member of Congress to take action on this issue, was saying that scientists say we only have a 10-year window before carbon pollution dramatically changes our way of life and hurts our communities. We were still trying to get it to some personal. Extreme heat, more intense and frequent storms, and increased risks of floods puts the safety of communities and people at risk unless we make significant changes now. So anytime I see climate crisis written into anything, and I know that's been a major push, I just recoil, because that is exactly what turns them off. And that whole, it's a crisis, you got to do it now, it just freaks them, they push back.
So I want to give,
Can I just add one quick thing? I think the literal elephant in the room is the national attention to our president, who has been basically a denier-in-chief. And so I think that's magnified an issue that might have been going down, and we've instead had the federal government transformation and actually into regulation changes. So I think that has just kept it. In some ways, people tried to find something optimistic about it, that there was more coverage of the fact that Trump had said, it's cold outside, where's global warming? But overall, that has been a huge, it's not just a distraction, it's been an enormous change in the way the federal government is approaching the problem. So I think that alone currently is one of the things that keeps denialists kind of buoyant when they have a president who's denying a lot of different things.
Yeah. I feel like it's time to open it up to questions from you all. Elliot?
Laurie Elliott Derringer from C2ES. You talked about how in your work, and we see this in lots of other polling, that there's certainly been a shift in public attitude, strengthening understanding, support for action across the political spectrum. You see a majority of conservatives and Republicans not just accepting the reality, but saying that they support stronger action. But there's still this enormous disconnect from where the public is and where the political sphere is. And while there may be some partisan divide among the public, there's this stark partisan divide among the politicians. I mean, you spend time on the Hill, you have some insight into the constraints that may be operating on Republican lawmakers, that their voters are saying this is an issue that we accept and is important to us. What is keeping them from more directly accepting, acknowledging the issue, supporting the kinds of actions that we need? Well, what is it in the media sphere? What is it in our electoral processes? What are the structural constraints and the other forces at play there?
Well, it's partly it's mostly the electoral process, and in terms of primaries and caucuses, the people that participate in those is a very, very small spectrum. My home state of Colorado just shifted to allowing unaffiliated voters to vote in primaries, to choose one and vote in that. Those types of electoral reforms have a massive impact on who becomes the candidate from that side of the aisle. And most voters, despite this national conversation the Democrats have been having about electability in a general election tends to be one of the weakest attributes that a candidate can have, because they much more care, does that person share my values, think like I think, prioritize the same issues that I do. So I have long said that the environmentalists ought to put a lot of their efforts into changing the electoral process, because that would have one of the biggest impacts in terms of who are the candidates that actually most people will end up choosing. But obviously, there's no denying that how we raise funds for campaigns also has an impact. I don't think that's shocking to anyone in this room. But, I've seen that the other thing is that, one of the best positive experiences in terms of candidate politics that I had was, for example, John McCain, when he ran in 2000, not the later time, the first one was exciting. So the first time was, he talked a lot about healthcare because he did hundreds of town halls in which people came up to him and told him very personal stories about healthcare. And so it was no shock to me that he was that vote later on, prior to his death, to retain those reforms that have been put in place. Because those personal stories, he could recall them back. He would recall them back. And they sit in your gut in a very different way. I was just on the Hill as Senator Coons created the bipartisan, I'm going to get the name of it wrong, some sort of bipartisan caucus. Thank you. Thank you. And so I sat and talked with one of his staffers, and someone in my group said, why? Why did he suddenly want to do this? And she said, his children asked him, their grown children, asked him, what are you doing for our kids? Mm-hmm. And it sat in his gut, like, what am I doing to address this problem that is going to have a massive impact on my grandkids? Mm-hmm. And that's why. She said it wasn't facts, it wasn't information, yeah. It was a very personal connection. Right. And so I think that, obviously having those youth activists here, they need to, hopefully some of them are somebody's grandkids, because that alone, I'm going to That's one of the best stories I've ever heard.
Can I just add one point, which is, I think your question is well said in the sense that the corruption of the electoral process is a core problem with all kinds of social ills
Yes.
that are unsolvable. And time and again, what I have observed is that the influence of children is underestimated. So you look at secondhand smoke. Why did secondhand smoke become an issue? Why did seatbelts become an issue? Why do people wear bike helmets in the United States? And a whole list of others. Ain't because companies decided to fund politicians, ain't because people were enlightened by knowledge. It's because children were taught in school and went to their parent and said, Dad, why are you smoking? You're going to kill yourself. There was a professor at Syracuse who sent his students home for winter break as a climate change science course to talk to their climate skeptic parents. You can tell a reporter to go to, you can tell a politician you're a liar, you can be skeptical of scientists and what they're saying, but if your child comes up to you and says, hey, Dad, what are you doing for my future? It's much harder. And so, you know, I don't know that anyone in this room has the power to change our electoral process, although I'd like us to think about that seriously. We can report stories about what children are saying and how that influences their parents. Because I can tell you from a public health standpoint, there have been few forces more powerful in the world than that, particularly in places like the United States.
Yeah, there's actually been some recent research on that, and it shows that the effect of children on their parents on the subject of climate change is very strong, and in particular, the impact of female children on male conservative
yes.
parents.
Yep.
So
Go
very
figure.
Interesting, right?
Shocking to anyone who's a parent in such a situation. Shocking.
I'll work on that at Thanksgiving.
There and there. Okay.
Ethan Cohen, CNN. Obviously, this election cycle, especially maybe exclusively on the Democratic side, climate change has become a much bigger issue, and in Washington, there are all these new plans like the Green New Deal and these things that it seems to me have kind of gotten tied in with lots of Republican critiques of Democrats, of socialists, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that those kinds of arguments are shifting people's perceptions of the issue, or are people kind of separating like the Green New Deal as a potential solution, which is maybe socialist or whatever, versus the issue being a problem?
So what I'm seeing, the Green New Deal is definitely a hot button, to use their own language, of the voters. And the whole socialism argument is very problematic, not just for climate, but for a host of other issues that have to date not been as politicized, early childhood education being a primary one. I think it's going to matter who the nominee is to a great extent in terms of how that all plays out. So the socialism attacks, I just think it got to be this Green New Deal, and it's a gang of four, and it's all that, and all that. But I think that someone eventually it's going to be the Warren plan or this plan or, whatever it is. And that's going to, by and large, separate it from that. And there's still going to be, Tucker Carlson is still going to get on the news and call it all socialism. So we know that. Granted, he's had a massive shift in his ideology over time. So I'm not as concerned right now because I think there's so much more to come that is going to impact that whole dialogue. That Green New Deal is going to be so, 4 months ago that it's not going to, I mean, I know that's sad, but I think it's going to evolve into whoever the nominee is. And that could be better for climate change, or that could put us into a much worse position, depending on who that might be.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I think the prominence of climate as an issue across all of these, however many, 18 candidates, I don't know, did anyone in this room file to run for president? But I think I've never seen it, having followed a lot of elections, this prominent, and even having Washington Governor Inslee, be the climate candidate. He drops out, and yet people keep picking up pieces of his platform. So the repetition, the fact that it's, and you're hearing more about it in the debates, whereas in the past, you go back In the Obama era, it didn't really come up in the debates, and it's never had this degree of prominence. Now, maybe the underbelly is that it makes it a Democrat issue. However, it at least is an issue among Democrats. You know, usually it falls down to about 18 or 20 with the economy and health up at the top. So it's definitely moved up, and I think that spreads across the middle part of the constituency or the audience. So I think overall it's much more prominent than we've seen it in the past.
And being included in the debates is important because people generally, I spent much of 2012 just doing focus group after focus group of Republican or of swing women voters. And generally what they had seen, read, or heard about the campaign was either the debate or TV ads, and that was it. And so being included and being prominent in the debates is critically important. And there are people out there that are just lobbying to get their little issue in as a debate question. And so I think that the fact that it has become so prominent is important because that means it's going to continue to be part of that debate conversation. And that's one of the few places that we saw people picked up externally driven not a TV ad news about
Okay,
candidates.
Thanks. We have lots of questions. So
Yeah.
we're going to go there, and then John, and then Emily. Go ahead.
I'm Eva Wolf. I'm a freelance science journalist from Germany. Thank you so much. It was really interesting for me to hear from you what people want to hear or what they listen to. But it's kind of frustrating on the other hand side because I wonder if we are the right persons to do this. To me, it sounds like we have to pack the stories nicely that people are interested in. We have to tell them about their children. And in the end, they listen to their grandchildren and not to scientists. We should talk about climate crisis. And we shouldn't quote scientists saying how that this is a crisis. And I really wonder if this is our job, if this is not something politicians have to do, or lobbyists or climate activists. And this is an important work, but at least in Germany, I think you have this as well. Here we have big discussions if journalists should become activists, and we tend to say, no, we should separate this. So my question is shouldn't we tell people what is, and there is a climate crisis, and somehow educate them and hope that they will listen to us, rather than packing the stories nicely and do this activist's job?
I think in my mind there's a far cry from what I would call as activism versus reporting science. And I think the issue is that, as I alluded to in the scope of health, most health stories are never reported, period. And if people understood something about the health consequences, they might look at the issue differently.
Yeah, I would add it's similar on making the linkages between climate change and extreme weather events. I'm not saying the whole story has to be on that, but to have all of these stories about extreme weather events, very rarely using the science that is there to make those connections, I think that's a missed opportunity. And again, I don't think that's activism. Yeah, okay, John, and then Emily.
Add to that briefly though, because I think it's unfair what we're talking about calling it a crisis, because I think in the Guardian's position, like, that is the situation that is happening right now. It is a crisis. It's the most accurate word that we can use, and it conveys that to people. So for journalists to avoid using the accurate terms because they might turn off certain readers who feel a certain way because of their political motivations, I think that would be really irresponsible journalism.
I would say I don't think it's their political motivations. They honestly don't know that it's a crisis. And when someone says, crisis, crisis, and they wake up every morning and they take their kids to soccer, and like maybe the weather's weird and maybe the roses are blooming at a different time, but that's not a crisis to them. Most people are living their lives and not seeing a crisis. And so when all they hear, they enter into that dissonance where they are like, it's not a crisis. Like, a crisis is the sky falling down on me today for most people.
I understand what you're saying and like how it might make some people feel, but I also think it's our job to convey what's happening. And if we don't use strong language, I don't know how people will understand that.
Yeah, like, is it our job to not tell the truth because somebody isn't getting it?
It's not, I don't see it as a lie. I see it as language. You're saying the exact, I work with scientists a lot where we're trying to say, look, your words become walls. And people have to jump over that wall
Yeah.
in order to get to what you want them to know. And if you put up walls everywhere, they aren't going to take the time and energy to jump over that. They're going to flip right past it because a lot of it is just this,
Yeah.
right? You're already, the people who think it's a crisis, right? That's not enough to get that guy on Capitol Hill to do what I want him to do.
Yeah.
That's not enough. And we're creating these mental barriers.
Yeah.
There's a story, it's a long time ago. Some of you probably were not even alive or watching TV at the time. The guy who created Desperate Housewives, it was on ABC, it was a massive hit. This takes a minute, sorry. But he talked about how he wrote the pilot and he was pitching it to all these people, and he'd walk in and he got turned down by everybody. If you go to Wikipedia, you can see like he got turned down by Lifetime, and I don't even know if Hallmark was a channel then, but he probably would have gotten turned down by them. And finally his buddy said, okay, pitch it to me. Tell me how you're selling it. And he said, well, it's a satire about women in the suburbs. And the guy goes, whoa, stop. It's not a satire. It's a nighttime soap about women in the suburbs. The next guy he goes into bought the pilot. Again, the show was like #1 until it made people into massive stars, most of the women that were on the show. So I am saying that we're saying satire, and if we said nighttime soap, they'd read past the lead. They wouldn't scroll past it. And so you're not being disingenuous. You're simply not creating this mental wall that they have to leap 50 feet over in order to get to the meat of the problem.
I'm sorry, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I think it's super important to the conversation we're having. I think that we can see that in polls that people do care about what's happening with the climate, increasingly so, and that it has very little effect on what lawmakers are doing. So I don't know that it's necessarily that reporters need to convince people that this is happening and a serious problem, but that the people in charge need to believe
Right,
it.
like we didn't create the.
Now, I have a whole chart that shows you where like acid rain and where a number of other environmental problems were in terms of public polling. We are not there yet. We are not at the level where people actually took action in terms of policy.
It's our job to tell them what they want to hear, or to tell what we think what's the truth.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not nice if people don't.
We should probably talk over this with a glass of wine in our hand later.
I think that's right. John, you next.
I mean, I was going to ask along a similar line. I mean, my question is, I guess, is there a way to talk about it that does reach multiple types of audiences at the same time? Like when so I'm happy to hear that National Geographic is trusted. When I'm in like conservative parts of the country, I'm from Oklahoma, right? Like I'm from a very conservative place. When I'm talking to people about climate change there, you almost have to say global warming because the term climate change doesn't register as something that we're causing. Like I'm just saying like the reaction I get when I have a conversation. Then I've been an advocate too for like saying climate crisis, climate emergencies. I think that's accurate. I don't know, I'm sort of stuck and I'm wondering if you all have any advice on ways to communicate to broad audiences that include people who are alarmed and aware, and also those who, may not see that it is a crisis, and need to be somehow like convinced that, that term is necessary to use.
As a term that I think is really useful is climate disruption, because climate change is actually, I think, a problematic term to use because we use the same term to describe natural climate change as we do and so people say, yeah, sure, climate's always changing. Climate disruption gets to the fact that we are changing the climate. We are disrupting it. And I think for people who resist the term crisis, resist using it as a journalist because it doesn't feel neutral or something to them, or for people like Laurie's describing, I think that term goes a long way.
Although I might add, language I think is really important. So I've done looks at the use of language, and obviously global warming has gone down, climate change has gone up, there's a long history with that. I think using words, I mean, the scientists are gonna say it one way, but I think saying human-caused climate change can be perhaps more helpful than saying climate crisis or having something you have to say each time. I think climate disruption, at least a decade or maybe 15 years ago, I had a panel in which Steve Snyder was on, and John Holdren, who later became the Obama's science advisor. And he said at the time, I asked the same question. He said, I think it should be global climate disruption. And I said, John, that is just not going to happen. Do you see that being used by anybody?
Yeah, I'm seeing it picked up.
I mean, I think it's a good term. I just think, to some degree, going back to not worrying so much, climate change is going to be the basic set of words, and people alternate and put global warming in stories just to break it up. But I think you can even have stories in which you don't have climate change as a phrase until a little further down in the story. Who was I talking with? I guess it was Rob from, it's Rob, right? Yep. Oh, good. From Montana, writing about the water crisis. You can get into this story with so many angles, and I don't think there has to be, got to have climate change per se right at the top. I think you're going to reach people with different stories, and whether they're technology or it's water or something else. So I think climate crisis is fine too. I think it's just hard to shift the way people are doing business. It's more important to have more coverage of stories that involve this subject, whether it's climate disruption or whatever. It's hard to shift the language quickly.
It is. Last two questions. We're there and there. Oh, and I see one more in the back. We might have to do three. Okay, quick.
I'll be quick. What do we need to include in the conversation that might be counterintuitive for what I think a lot of folks in this room are thinking? I mean, when you come up against somebody who is resistant to this, can we not assume that they might actually have some valid points, that climate scientists may have overblown some parts of the general argument? That there is some debate that is legitimate debate, not denialism.
Yeah. So I can take a stab at that one.
Sure.
So I think this comes up all the time, and I was giving a talk just last week where someone said, the climate models have been wrong. And don't you believe this professor at MIT who's a legitimate climate scientist? And I said, these issues are besides the point. So whenever there's no legitimate scientific debate. So the issue is, sure, there are legitimate arguments. There's arguments about the so-called climate sensitivity. How much will the planet warm if we double CO2? There's a legitimate debate about that in the scientific community. There's best estimates, but there's no debate about the reality that is carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are contributing substantially to warming, and the debates that may exist around that are maybe how much or what's going to happen here versus there. And so all of the questions of uncertainty, if they're legitimate, are on the margins. And this has been a classic tactic to sort of create a sense that there's uncertainty about the mainstream of science. So that's how I generally approach those. I've yet to meet a legitimate, this 97% consensus thing I think is worth noting. So it was actually Steve Snyder who published a follow-up study that looked at, if you look at the folks, so of the 97%, of the 3%, those folks actually aren't climate scientists. So if people actually do research, and there's really no one who debates the main idea, and so,
I want to go beyond that. Yeah. Where is the debate? So that I don't just have to shut somebody up and say, you're out of the conversation, you've got something to contribute.
I'd like to add something.
Yeah,
go ahead. All right, so I want to add two things. One, on the subject of whether the scientists have been alarmist, all the analysis that's been done to date suggests that they have understated, not overstated. And there's actually been published, they've published on that. Scientists tend to err on the side of least drama, is the way they put it. And I think that's quite accurate. The other thing is that on the 97%, 3%, a study was done of the 3%, and they found that there were major errors in all of those studies. So, I mean, there's really good science on this. So it's not about shutting them down. Where there is debate is on some of the details of the science. How fast is sea level going to rise due to ice dynamics that we don't fully understand? Those kinds of questions. It's just a question of bad or worse, whereas most of those debates are taking place. And on the solution side, some. Did you want to jump in?
But I think the question of the science, again, the core aspect of the fact that it's happening isn't debated. And I think in stories, too often, the deniers are trying to keep it on the science, because if you keep debating the science, then you don't take action. So there are legitimate debates about what to do about it. But sometimes in stories, people will apples and oranges, quote a scientist and then quote someone who's in opposition of what to do about it. And they're not apples, it's apples and oranges. So I think trying to sort out what kind of story it is and what kinds of experts are debating. There's no debate about the core concept.
Ari, did you want to finish
I was just going to say, Paul Farmer coined this term about academics, which is analysis paralysis, right? So, how much certainty do we really need to take action that is required? And so the core question in front of us is, how much do we need to know about the changing climate to justify actions? What do we know about the damages? What are the harms? And what are the benefits of taking actions and weighing those two things? And so what I would say, there are lots of areas where there's debate: sea level rise, how fast it's going to warm, where it's going to warm faster, particularly around precipitation patterns. I mean, there are a lot of areas in which science has a lot to say. But the amazing part about the circumstance is that the core of what we know is more than enough to move us in a different direction, right? And so the challenge becomes, there rarely is a scientific publication that's published with this is the definitive study, no further science is necessary, right? They always end by, this study warrants further investigation into this challenge. And so from a clinician standpoint, right? So this is one of the differences between being a pure scientist and being a clinician. This would be equivalent in pediatrics. The classic example is a baby under a month of age. So a baby has a fever under a month of age. There is probably an 8% chance that baby has a bacterial infection when untreated, would be very serious. Now that 8%, maybe 1 or 2%, are things like meningitis and bacteria in the bloodstream, which would definitely, almost certainly kill the child if left untreated, or high chance. And so what do? So there's like 92% confidence that, there's 92% chance that it's going to be fine. It's about 8% chance that it's life-threatening, okay? So what do? We test the blood, the urine, the spinal fluid for bacteria. We give antibiotics before the test results are back, because the consequences of inaction are potentially life-ending. So that's exactly how I, as a clinician, view climate change, which is, sure, we can do more science to improve our confidence, and we absolutely need to, but we don't have 92%, we have way more confidence. And if I were a clinician and I were managing the planet, I would be sued for malpractice right now. I would be negligent, because it is not like we have a planet B. We're acting as if there's a planet B. And there are lots of other things in the scientific literature about this, like Marty Weitzman, as an economist here, was very active proponent of what he called the fat tails problem. So if you look at the scientific uncertainty around what's called the equilibrium climate sensitivity, the amount that the planet will warm if we double CO2, the middle of the road estimate is about 3 degrees Celsius, which everyone thinks is bad. Like, 2 degrees guardrail, Paris 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees, so we get to 560, 3 degrees is the best time. But more than 10% of the probability in the distribution of science is 6 degrees Celsius. More than 10%, okay? That is a risk. If you had a child and you put them on an airplane and there was a 10% chance that thing was going to go up in flames, would you put your child on that airplane? No. This is what I mean, folks. This is negligence. This is negligence, and it's in part because people ask questions on the margins to make the mainstream science look. It's partially because science puts up walls and saying, well, we're not really sure. But as a clinician, I can tell you that there's only an 8% chance that this infection is life-threatening, but I know that if I don't do something, it's going to be an unmitigated disaster for this child's life. And that's irresponsible. So that's how I deal with these questions, which is, sure, there are legitimate dates, and many of the conservatives, in fact, have better questions, and they're totally legitimate. And the challenge is, you don't want to blow people off. You need to redirect to saying, what are we really choosing here? And Gina usually talks about this, but if this were 40 years ago, the solution set was very different. We have, 60% of the industry, we have stuff we can be doing that we are not doing.
Right.
That is cost. What are the states with the most amount of electricity from renewables? Anyone is a percent of total renewables?
I know this.
Iowa, Kansas.
Yeah,
Right.
we all know.
This is not because they're trying to save the planet, it's because it's cheaper.
Right.
Okay, I'll stop.
On that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop. Thank you all. I'm sorry. I know there were still more questions. Feel free to come up and talk to the panelists afterwards and join me in thanking them for their